Well, good afternoon. It is a beautiful day on the East Coast. Temperatures in the 70s, low humidity. So anybody joining us from the East Coast and
Or
looking at
the
the registration,
Midwest.
the highest numbers were New York, New Jersey, and Maryland, those states. All those people are probably enjoying some much-deserved pool time. But nevertheless, Laura and I are here, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happened on day 2 of the original summit. We call this session "Tell Me More," which really means we want people to ask the questions, and yeah, for some people it might even be nap time. So, but this is our invitation to anybody watching live to do submit your questions so we can respond to them. Anything that you heard from either Laura or myself, or somebody else, you can talk about it. We may not have the answer, but we can certainly speculate what they may have meant or give our opinions. We're never shy to share our opinions on something that somebody said. But I thought today was a really interesting day when it comes to a really important topic in teaching.
The whole idea of feedback,
Yeah.
performance and feedback. So as I was listening to Florencia this morning, she asked a lot of good questions for us to ponder. So it's great to have a little extra time over the summer, maybe. Um, the one that struck me the most was, do we really believe that we need feedback to grow? And I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves, both if we're thinking about teachers and the feedback that we want to give them, or students, learners, and the feedback we feel we need to give them. So, is growth possible without feedback? That's an interesting question in a profession that is so dominated by grading. And that applies to teachers and students. We grade them, we grade our teachers against different scales when they're evaluated, and then we're grading our learners. So, it's something worth thinking about.
Yeah, no, I agree. On my little note, I wrote when she said a controlling feedback right away, and unfortunately, I think that is how we use grades often, right? Often grades are used for a teacher to exert control. We've all been there. We've seen it, or we may have even done it ourselves, where we literally used grades and hung them over our students' head. If you don't do this, you will get a bad grade.
Well, and I
Uh,
heard Joshua, I think he was talking about a workshop he gave about listing all of the things we do for compliance
yeah,
that
yeah,
go into our grades. And yeah, and I laughed. Someone commented during that session, grammar and grading. If I'm presenting all day, those are the two topics that I know I can use in the afternoon to wake teachers up. But analyzing carefully, like Ben said, what is the purpose of the grade? What are we trying to report progress on? And how are we doing that?
well, and I would argue we're not trying to report any progress. We're just trying to sort people into different buckets
Well,
and
I do think
control.
there is a movement out there. It's scattered and it's not anchored, not well anchored in the profession yet, but a deeper understanding that we need to think about progress and not just,
Yeah.
here's your 89 versus 92 and what does that mean? I think teachers are beginning to grapple with that, but it's hard. It's hard to change a paradigm of sorting that has existed. And so what does that actually mean? Someone in that session wanted to talk more about homework, and I thought, Ben gave a really good answer, but it's one of those questions about, are we grading it? Does it count? What do we do? And
Yeah.
it's from two perspectives.
It is, yeah. So it just reminded me of one of the TELL sub-criteria that I always get questions about is PF5, which says the teacher's grading system reflects multiple measures and an emphasis on language performance. And then one of the sub-criteria there is the teacher works with colleagues to ensure grading practices provide feedback for language growth. So TELL pretty much says that it's possible, doesn't tell us exactly perhaps how, but that we should be working towards that we should be doing feedback that does help students grow as a language learner. In my mind, that is the most important thing, right? Of the whole
I
feedback
think
thing.
so. It makes our rubrics important, but
Yeah.
it also means that the rubrics have to be student friendly against criteria they really understand. There's value in having students break apart, analyze, and put a rubric back together
Yeah.
because you can't really understand the growth if all you're doing is checking a box and saying, this is where I'm at. So I just think the same is true for teachers. If you look at the Danielson framework, the difference between, the 3 and the 4, the highest and the second highest, is it clear to the teacher? Is it clear to the administrator? And when it's not, how can you achieve what you don't understand?
Yeah. But I think it changes the purpose of rubric, right? So when we first started with rubrics in education, it was about grading, right? It was putting some descriptors that align to certain grades, and I think we're beginning to move away from that, and we're having students more involved and getting to understand the rubric. Um, but it still have to think about it. It's not about how do I complete this task, but that rubric should be how will I be able to grow with the information from that, right? So there ought to be something on that rubric that goes beyond the perfect or the completing the task. Because if not, that rubric, the only message I get from that, you did it, yay, but there's no feeding forward, as Florencia called it, right? So in my mind, the rubric always has to have something that goes beyond beyond the abilities of the students, or perhaps even beyond the abilities of the teacher. So
Well, and I think what I really liked about what she said is think about feedback as interpersonal communication.
yeah,
If it's not two-way, then really think about what am I doing with this particular task? How am I going to handle it? If there's not going to be any feedback that's interpersonal that allows the students to benefit from that feedback, hmm, am I wasting my time? But I also think that before students turn in something, a task, they can grade themselves on the rubric. I'm
sure.
far
Yep,
more interested in knowing what they think about their performance before I assess their performance. They can write down what they want feedback on. I mean, think about it, Thomas. That's the number one thing we try to tell administrators to do. If you walk into a classroom to observe a teacher, it's a scheduled observation, then don't you want to say to that teacher, what would you like me to look for? What would you like for me to give you feedback on? It's often the question we ask on the forum.
yep,
Then why aren't we doing the courtesy to our students of saying, what would you like me to give you feedback on? Because if they're really beginning to self assess their own learning progress, then they should know exactly what they need to continue to move forward. And if they
yeah,
don't, we have an indication that something's not quite right.
yeah, I agree.
So I like Florencia's personalized approach to feedback.
Yeah, I think that the personal idea is fantastic. I've seen it happening once. A colleague that you and I both know, we were visiting a school, and one of the students was working on a paper that they had gotten back, and he ended up talking to a student I forgot for multiple minutes, and they just kind of go back and forth, and he just asked questions about the paper and blah. And at the end, the student said to him, "You think I should write this again?" And he just responded like, "Well, I don't know. Do you want to?" And she said, "Yeah, I think I can do better than that." But it was the most. I mean, I just stood there in awe because it was such a
Honest
marvelous, natural conversation. And this was a quote unquote struggling student. But through that interpersonal feedback conversation, he was able to get the students to a point where they wanted to do the work again, not because they want to get a better grade, not because the rubric said here are all the things that you messed up on, or because it was marked up with some kind of magic code. No, because they realized they can do better, right? And I think that's true for all of us. Whenever we have done something, we immediately know, oh, I could have done this, or I could have done that, or I could have used this, or I could have done this slide. I could have put more salt into this dish. I could have done anything in life. We know what we mess up on because we know what we're trying to go for. And so to get to a point of getting a student to realize that and knowing that and then wanting to do it again, I think that's winning the whole ballgame.
Well, and I also think that the type of feedback you just described, teachers who teach large classes, 5 classes a day, 6 classes a day, minimal opportunities to have deep conversations like that. But
Oh,
that also calls into question that whole, is that type of feedback necessary for growth?
yeah,
Yes, at certain points in time it is, but really you can't get better at writing unless you just write a lot.
yeah, yeah,
So giving students time to engage in, maybe they're going to read with their peer, it'll be shared with their peers, there might be some type of class feedback, but we can't expect busy teachers to do um, all of that all the time.
yeah.
There was a
No,
year I had 217 students. That
that's
was ridiculous, and I would have killed myself if I tried to do that depth of
of
feedback for
course.
every student all the time.
Yeah. Right.
You
So we
we do have one question there in the chat.
ooh,
Do we wanna take it on?
sure. Now that we know the answer. So Maris asked, what do you all think about the exceeding expectations as the highest
This
level?
is where Thomas and I get to figure out if we agree or not.
Yeah, no pressure.
I will go first. So, to me, when I see a rubric that says exceeding expectations, I think that I'm looking at, so you never know unless you look at the rubric, right? But I think I'm looking at a proficiency descriptor rubric where the idea is that we're trying to reflect whether it's intermediate low, novice high, novice mid, not even on the chart. Um, in which case, it's fine if students know where the next step is. That's always appropriate. But if you try to turn that into a grade book, you can't. So it almost knocks the highest category of exceeding expectations out of the ballpark. So is it giving students, I think it was Florencia that said it because I found myself nodding my head. Is it giving them the next step feedback? Or is the feedback that's being given way too general, like try to write with strings of sentences? That might not be enough concrete feedback to move that student forward and to exceed expectations. So a rubric should always allow, in my mind, a learner to see what's next. It's like the swim coach that says, your flip turn is good, but I'm going to tell you to go into the wall a little sooner. I've got a specific strategy to make it better. I'm not just going to be general and say, work on your flip turns. And sometimes our exceeding expectations category is the equivalent of work on your flip turns.
So the script is important. Well, I think I have just a different view on that. And then I can even, for myself, have two different views on it. One, I born and raised in a German educational system where in order to get the highest grade, you did have to exceed expectations. In fact, we were told you had to be smarter than the teacher to get the A. The only way you got an A if it was you had 100+ points potentially on any kind of examination. Anything else, it was a B. So that kind of clouded my original thinking. But having now been, of course, part of the American education system for 25 years, or well, I guess longer than that if I include my own education, um, is that I agree that it has to see the next step, but I also don't think there is one rubric for the entire class, right? I always viewed as the rubric is for the kid. And so you asked earlier, or we even said it in the tell statement, it has to be for growth. So I don't like those markers of expectation, mean expectation, because you essentially have to shift it for every single child, right? And so again, if a kid knows because of what they've done in the previous unit or in the previous year or whatever prior to this learning experience, if they know where they are and where they're trying to go, they should be able to find themselves, with the help of the teacher, of course, in a personal conversation on that rubric. And so that's why I've always been a big fan of giving the kids as much information as possible um, on a rubric, perhaps as high as you think they might be able to go throughout the entire sequence of study. So when I was working district, our rubrics went all the way through advanced low because that's kind of was the highest we could have possibly were shooting for at the end of the 5th or 6th year. And so to me, I think it's more important that the kids can see the whole spectrum and find themselves and can articulate with the help of a teacher of what they have to do to get to that next level. By putting those other labels on there, again, we're trying to control everybody to be here or there or
No, they're not.
approaching. And so to me, that doesn't matter. That's the beauty of um, the proficiency / performance, whatever document you want to use, can-do statements. They do give us some pretty clear descriptors. And we also know students are moving around, right? Maybe expectations is whatever. Maybe meeting expectation is novice high for your class, but maybe on this particular assessment, I'm just novice mid because I don't like that topic. I had a rough evening. I got into a fight with my big
I don't
sister. I just,
like it today.
whatever. And then next month, I love that topic, and I've been really into it. And you did some really cool activities and showed us some stuff that I really responded to. So now I did intermediate low. Well, so today I'm exceeding. Well, did I grow yet? No. It's just today I was at this level, and so that's why I think having different names, and if you want to use the proficiency words, or if you don't want to come up with other ones, or if you want to come up with numbers, I don't care. If you use numbers, it makes it much easier to turn into grades, but that's a whole other conversation. But I think it's better than getting at this meeting expectations, approaching expectations, or exceeding expectations. I don't know if
Well, I
Marissa,
think
that's
that
here, but
might have
that's
answered Maris's question. It might not have, but I think we're saying very similar things. It's really important that students know where they're going,
Mhm.
but it's really important that the feedback be actionable. That
Yep.
if all we do is give them the descriptors that are broad based, like use more sentences, that may not be the performance feedback that's actionable. That's what my concern is, that we
Sure.
go
Yeah.
too teacher directed in those, maybe
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
categories, the way they're written. How do we get students to understand the baby steps to get there? Because
Yeah.
they need baby steps.
They do.
Mhm.
And those can be very specific, right? They don't even have to come from those descriptors. They can be more like describing of how to get to that.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
like you
Use
need
more
to connect the
transitive
words. Yeah.
words.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
if that's what they need to do, or don't rely on level one vocabulary, use current and new vocabulary. I mean, if that's, they need to know what it is, they need to know what piece they're working on. But
Yeah.
I think you want them to be able to identify it.
Mhm.
Gradually over time, they should be aware that they are working to use better vocabulary.
And they do, if it's part of the learning process, right? In my mind, that's the academic vocabulary that our students should know. And so if that's part of the learning because you use it when you introduce a unit, you use it when you share your learning targets, you use it, if it's present in the class so the students know, then they will get there. It's not something you can just do at the beginning of the year and then at the end of the year and then
And you
expect.
practice, you show them a written example and you ask them,
Exactly. Yep, yep.
"Where is this and how would you make it better?"
You can use last year's assessment from some kids. They would love to see other kids having done that work at different levels, right? So,
It's such a big conversation.
yeah. Feedback? Oh, we can get that done in about 20 minutes.
Yeah, no problem. Were there other things for you, Thomas, that came up throughout
Well,
the day?
I just think we can make that same connection that we were talking about, the idea of feedback and feedback for growth. And again, connecting to that term controlling feedback when it comes to teachers too, right? Because in my mind, that's what happens so often in teacher evaluation. It's controlling feedback that they're getting. Let's make a arbitrary goal that comes from some other office for our building for this year that now applies to every content area.
Mhm,
And I will measure your success and your continued employment
mhm,
based on this arbitrary goal.
mhm.
Probably not going to cause any teacher to change their practice. It may cause them to, well, I shouldn't say that. It may cause a teacher to change their practice. They may do what you ask them to do, but they're not going to grow and they're not going to know why they changed in their practice. But just what I've run into with learning targets so many times, right? There are some teachers who really, really hate the idea of learning targets, even though they can be so powerful for kids. But why is that? Because they were part of some kind of evaluation
office directed.
initiative, yeah, without ever explaining to the teacher what's the purpose. And I always know that when I go into a classroom and the bottom right-hand corner has all the learning targets from last month kind of taped on the bottom corner there, then I know they're doing it for compliance purposes, not for the
Educational
wonderful.
benefit.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's where feedback teacher, that's why unfortunately feedback for teachers, especially language teachers, right?
Mhm.
And I don't want to bash administrators because in their defense, they don't know. They likely did not have a positive language learning experience, if any at all. And so now here they are, they're coming into your Chinese middle school immersion classroom and they're supposed to give you feedback. That does seem like a daunting task for anyone, I would think.
Mhm. That's where you have to ask teachers, "How's it going? How can I
Yeah.
help you?"
Yeah.
You asked a question during your presentation today, you put teachers on the spot, and you got very few responses. You asked them to think about a success that they had had, and I was
Mhm.
just kind of chuckling to myself because if you had flipped that question, Thomas, and asked them to name a challenge
Oh, we
last
would have been there all day.
the, comment section would have flooded in. But, teachers are struggling right now, and really, I think all we really have to do is stop and cause all teachers to stop and reflect like that every single day. And anyone listening that's in a leadership capacity or for yourself, at the end of the day, get in the habit of reflecting on what went well. Jot it down, keep a notebook. It's like somebody said today, keep those positive notes, Thomas, I think you did, from teachers and students. It reframes your mindset. Thanks for sharing that, Maris. It reframes your mindset. It puts you in a good mood at the end of the day because far more went right than went wrong. And then it frees you up to say, okay, now let's talk about what's frustrating. Because we tend to walk in at the end of the day to the teacher's lounge, to our department, and then we just immediately start saying, oh, this went wrong. No.
Well, and I wonder if, yes, you're right. It feels like it was a terrible year and everything went wrong, and it was extremely frustrating. But I wonder if perhaps this is actually the year that the teacher grew the most. I know it doesn't feel like that right now. I know it doesn't feel like that. But if you think about it, learning is uncomfortable, growing is uncomfortable. Perhaps it is so uncomfortable right now because before this pandemic, we were all very comfortable in what we were doing.
That's Madeline Hunter's famous quote that I love. Whenever
Kids.
I don't know what I'm doing, I know that I'm growing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so that's what I'm saying.
Mhm.
I I realize we have not gotten there yet, and maybe teachers will get there eventually. But perhaps that is exactly what happened this year. Perhaps this year we grew the most, and that's why it did feel so uncomfortable. That's why we can't identify the positive moments because when you're learning something new and you're putting some piece of furniture together for the first time, that is incredibly frustrating. And you're not going to describe that as a positive experience and memory, right? But
Mhm.
you do later on, you're like, oh, I built this. Or when you're
Meredith's
growing,
comment up for everyone.
what did Meredith say?
They're called growing pains for a
Oh,
reason.
yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right.
It is.
Yep.
I think, that kind of is a really good summary thought too, because when you come to a session like today, the virtual summit, and you listen to different people, or I know some people are watching the recorded sessions, it's all growing pains when you identify something you want to work on. But I do think it's important to think about your strengths
Mhm.
and the focus you want for next year because you can't do it all. It's not possible.
No, no, definitely not.
Any thoughts or questions from those of you that are listening? Topic you want to throw out there? A problem you would like Thomas and I to solve for you?
In 90 seconds or less.
Yes, no problem. Or you should go and enjoy that beautiful weather and the swimming pool. And Maris, you cannot take a nap and ask questions at the same time. I noticed you did that, so must be time for your nap now. Okay, Meredith, we'll give you a yeah.
So there's another question. Oh, wow. Okay. That's a big one.
Specific.
Do you, do you have specific recommendations for tools to help teachers calibrate their ability to assess proficiency, like Linguafolio, for example, for students using the can-do statements? Oh, wow. That's
Well, ACTFL will be the first to tell you that teachers cannot assess the individual proficiency
I'll be second.
of their students. I mean, I'm just going to our national organization. And their reason for saying that teachers cannot assess proficiency is because proficiency is what you do out in the real world without supports. And so in the classroom, we're always in what ACTFL will term a performance scenario. So looking at the successful ACTFL can-do statements and looking at the performance indicators, and then maybe holding up as and looking at a piece of writing from a student and really thinking about in terms of the performance indicator there from ACTFL, what does it seem this student has done on this particular task? And then what ACTFL says is that if you get multiple indications that they are hitting novice high, like Thomas said earlier, a student might be novice mid on one day and then intermediate low on another. But if you get multiple indications that they're moving at novice high, intermediate low, novice high, you probably can say that they're novice high based on the content you've assessed them on. Send them out in the real world, and they might be novice mid because they have not prepared for that language or scenario. So the
But I,
easiest for me, though, is the successful ACTFL can-do statements.
yeah, I was going to say, but I think we should just like also acknowledge just the fact the question is that there's a need for teachers to have that ability or to at least be able to identify maybe not proficiency, but just knowing the levels is
Where they
already
are, where the
yeah,
student is, so you know how to get them to the next level,
yeah,
how to design your lessons to keep pushing them up.
yeah, correct.
Yeah. It really is important that teachers have that distinction between, Amanda, between proficiency and performance, because otherwise they start to conflate the two. And then it leads to students getting out in the real world. They go to Mexico on spring break with a family and they can't do what they think they should be able to do. They need to understand proficiency performance. Meredith, did you ever type your question, hon?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. Well, I do think that the OPI training is one of
wonderful.
the best trainings you can take.
Yeah,
That was profoundly impactful
and now
on
it's available
my
online, so
business
you don't even have to go.
Yeah, I mean, and you can start with the MOPI, for the two for the abbreviated one, because if you're really just teaching middle school, high school, MOPI is gonna get you most of the way there, and that's a shorter training. And then they give you samples, and then you really practice rating so that you start to feel like, "Oh, I get this better." I would recommend that for anyone.
I agree. Well, then I recommend we put a bow on this virtual summit.
Yes, and encourage all of you to continue watching the pre-recorded sessions.
Yeah, which people have been. I see there's lots of action and activity on those, and hopefully people will use the collaborative note-taking tools as well to continue learning and sharing. And with that, thank you, Laura, again for all your work on the summit and for joining us for the past 2 days.
What happened without you?
So,
Yeah, lots of work behind the scenes. Well, everyone, have a great summer. Not too many more summits.